In our last module, we looked at how we thought Russell might answer that question, what is the value of philosophy? In this final module for this article, we want to go back and pick up a question that we didn't address from our discussion about Russell's conception of philosophy. So remember that we said that in thinking about Russell's conception of philosophy, we want to be able to answer three different questions. We want to answer what's the goal of philosophy, we want to answer how it relates to practical everyday concerns, and we want to answer what sort of methodology does philosophy employ. And I suggested that we shouldn't answer that last question until we considered answers to the other questions and to the question, what is the value of philosophy? So now we want to go back and pick up that question. We want to try and answer that question. Specifically, we want to think about what Russell might say are the methods that philosophy employs. And I think we're in a pretty good position now to answer that question. So for starters, philosophy engages in critical examination of our convictions, of our prejudices, of our habits. So it looks at why we believe what we do. And it does so by evaluating, do we have reasons? Are those reasons good? Are those reasons definitive, or are those reasons sufficient, barely sufficient, and so on? So it evaluates the strengths and weaknesses of the reasons or lack thereof for our convictions. But I think in this last section, in some of the quotes that we looked at for the value of philosophy, we also get another aspect to this critical examination, namely this idea of intellectual imagination, of considering possibilities. So I think part of the methodology that Russell seems to implicitly suggest philosophy employs is this intellectual imagination, this consideration of alternative possibilities, of other perspectives, the idea that we don't just look at what we believe, but we look at what other people might believe, other answers to that same question, and we consider those other possibilities as well as our own. We look at the reasons someone might offer for those possibilities, just as we look at and evaluate the reasons that we have for our own. There's one other thing, I think, that we want to include in Russell's answer to that question, what methods does philosophy employ? And that is a creative, generative, refining aspect. So philosophy doesn't just critically assess possibilities. It doesn't just critically assess our reasons for our convictions. It also seeks to create an accurate, unified, and systematic worldview. It seeks to enlarge the self. And I think this is also part of the methodology that Russell sees in philosophy. This idea that we want to create, refine, systematize our understanding of who we are, what society is, what the universe is, and how we fit in both to society and to the greater universe. And so there is this creative methodology that I think Russell also associates with philosophic inquiry. So I want to close off this lecture on Russell's article, The Value of Philosophy, by just posing three more questions for us to think about. I'm not going to offer up answers to them. I'm just going to put them out there for us to consider. So when we think about Russell's conception of the nature and value of philosophy, I think there are three more questions that it would be useful for us to think about in relationship to each other. The first question is, does Russell think of philosophy as producing a product, as creating something? That's what philosophy does. Or does he think about philosophy as a process that is engaged in that is useful precisely in and of itself. And so I think some things that he says suggest this sort of product interpretation. Some things suggest this process interpretation, this idea that philosophy is an activity, the value of which isn't just in the things that it produces, but in the very activity itself. And so we got to think about that and decide what we think Russell would say about whether or not philosophy is primarily a process or primarily a product, one or the other, neither, or both. We've talked a bit about the value of philosophy in Russell's conception. And so we have some idea about the benefits he thinks philosophy accrues to an individual. Those are the things that he associates primarily with the value of philosophy. And he tells us that. However, he also suggests that there may be indirect values to humanity overall from the engagement with philosophy by an individual. And he contrasts this again with science and with industry. He tells us that science gives us these definitive truths that benefit all of humanity, and that industry creates these products and food and so on for the benefit of all of humanity. Philosophy, he says, doesn't produce goods. It doesn't create this definitive knowledge for all of humanity. And therefore, he locates its primary benefit in the individual. But he also suggests this idea that philosophy has benefits for humanity, for a larger society. And so we want to think about that relationship between the benefits of individuals, the things that they get out of studying philosophy, and the benefits that might accrue to society by those individuals studying philosophy and getting those benefits. And so in ending our lecture here, we ought to think about those three questions. I'm not going to give you definitive answers, but I encourage you to think about them for yourself.